All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Dr. Califf, for joining us, and congratulations again on your recent confirmation. We appreciate you joining us. So I'm going to jump right in and start the questions, and Tazeen and I are going to go back and forth asking those questions. So in your previous term as FDA Commissioner ended about 5 years ago. That seems like a relatively short period of time compared to other timelines, for example, the approval of a drug. And so what do you see as the major differences in FDA operations and the challenges the agency is facing compared to your previous tenure? And associated with that, how would you describe the agency's state of play today after an extended period of time in which resources had to be redirected to address COVID vaccines and therapies?
Well, first of all, it's good to be here. Sorry I can't be there in person, but there is a lot going on right now in Washington, so things are busy. You know, I'd say it's sort of a mixture of comments I would make about your question. First, the mechanics of the FDA are still intact, and I can honestly say, and I said this after my departure in 2017, I've been in academic medicine, I've been in big tech now, I've been in, worked with biotech and pharma. I think the FDA is far and away the most efficient decision-making machine of any place I've been. The whole 18,000 plus people here work together to tee up decisions on timelines, which, as you know, are closely watched by a number of people. And it's really, I wish all of the briefings I get could be made public, but of course there's a lot of confidential information in those briefings. So the mechanics are basically working. And of course, there is a difference in the last 5 years. The political atmosphere is much more charged than it was even in 2016. I think everyone today is fully aware of just how charged the political atmosphere is. And yet there are many areas of common ground among the politicians. But what this means for me basically is I have confidence in the basic machinery at the FDA. And of course, Janet Woodcock is staying on, which is a tremendous benefit for me because she knows every nook and cranny of the FDA and all the history and is very devoted to the mission. And it frees me up a bit to work on, you know, what I consider to be a number of critical overarching issues, which are not purely in FDA's domain, but have an enormous impact on the job the FDA does and what it means to society. So overall, it's, and the last comment I'll make, there are some issues where if you took my 2016 briefing and substituted my 2021 briefing, they would look essentially the same. And we can argue over whether that's good or bad, but some things have not changed much in the last 5 years, even very topical issues that are the subject of debate.
Great. Well, thank you. Tazeen, I'm going to turn the next question over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Joung. Dr. Califf, thanks again for joining us. So my question to you is on the accelerated review process. So as we all know, that's coming under increased scrutiny. Maybe at the top level, how do you view the accelerated review process? You know, what place do you think that has? And what do you think needs to be changed about it at a top level?
Well, I think my comments on this are pretty well known, but I'll just review them quickly. First of all, I think accelerated approvals by the variety of mechanisms have a real place, and in part is those mechanisms are a reflection of American culture. In the American ethos, one is willing to take more risk in return for the potential for more benefit. We have a more individualistic society than most. And it should come under scrutiny because it's a very large proportion of initial marketing approvals now are using the accelerated pathway. And remember that the laws that Congress passed for the dominant mode allow the FDA to use unvalidated biomarkers based on an opinion as to whether it's reasonably likely that changes in those biomarkers will predict a clinical benefit. And so this reasonably likely, of course, means that people are accepting more uncertainty in return for earlier access to a treatment. It's well known that my mom, who had multiple myeloma, benefited greatly from an accelerated approval and got a few extra years of life that were highly valued by her and by the family. And so I've seen the benefits of it. But when you say what needs to be done, this has really been part of my career journey throughout, that I think the main things that need to be fixed are we need to assure patients and the public that the follow-up studies are going to get done so that we either confirm or refute the reasonably likely criteria. And I think that's a real lesion in the system that we need to work on. And there are many ways we can work on that I'm happy to discuss.
Right. So you just mentioned biomarkers, and a lot of the companies that are applying for accelerated approval for rare disease. And how do you view the importance of those biomarkers when trying to gauge the efficacy of a rare disease drug? And how do you balance that with the other portion of the argument, which is payers, insurance providers, basically balking at the very high price points that each of these approved drugs will end up costing the system?
Well, it's not just payers. As I just said, I think it's part of American culture, and I think rightfully so, that people would like to have earlier access in return for taking more risk. And so, and it's really important to point out, we're talking about unvalidated biomarkers. If it was a validated surrogate, that is a biomarker that has been, where it's been proven that a change in the biomarker reliably predicts a change in the clinical outcome, then you wouldn't need accelerated approval. You would get a regular approval based on that biomarker. And so there is always a balance, and the way to adjust the balance is to assure that the follow-up studies are done that find out what the answer is. And I think it's only logical, hopefully everyone agrees, that when the criterion is reasonably likely, you are accepting a higher possibility that the follow-up study could turn out to be negative. So while, yes, there are issues with payment, it's also just a fact that we need to have the answer. Is the benefit, does the benefit actually outweigh the risk when applied measuring the clinical outcomes that matter?
Okay, so now that you're in the seat, how long do you think it'll be before the agency is going to formally refine the way it looks at the approval, accelerated approval process, and what's going to be needed for companies on a go-forward basis?
Well, I think as everyone knows, well, let me just give the analogy that I'm using, and I admit I'm a sports fan, so if you're not a sports fan, I'm sorry. But the FDA is like a referee. It has a rule book. And the FDA admires players who play well and teams that play well, and it's rooting for a victory. But it applies the rules. And the question is, who makes the rule book? And that is our elected representatives, the U.S. Congress. So it's well known that we're in the final phase of user fee negotiations now, and that there's an interest in Congress in refining the rules of this particular game, the accelerated approval. And so it's not just a matter of, FDA is looking at this all the time to figure out, how to apply those rules. And, just like happens in sports, is it charging or blocking in basketball? There are refinements of the rules that the FDA can make, but the fundamental rule book is made by the Congress. And so this is very much in play right now. And my view of it, is clear. And I think Dr. Pazder in oncology has recently made some statements with which I agree. And many of you know that in the field of cardiology, it's been common for a long time to start your big outcome trial before the decision on approval is made, so that everyone can be assured that you're actually enrolling in a trial which is feasible and is going to get done. So that's the kind of thing that that we need is a much more transparent commitment, and that the follow-up studies are going to get done in a timely fashion and are actually going to answer the questions that patients need the answers to. I regard the payers as following that. If the answers are clear, then it's pretty hard to deny payment.
Okay, great. Dr. Joung?
Great. So I'm going to turn to a somewhat more controversial topic, so namely the recent approval of Aduhelm, the Alzheimer's drug. Do you think that the situation with that has created some degree of lack of confidence in the advisory committee approach? And do you see this as something that's a near-term challenge that needs to be addressed?
Well, first of all, let me say, I feel like when I made a comment on this before, I was terribly misquoted. And I'm very unhappy with it, and I'm almost feeling like whenever I answer questions from reporters now that we need to play the last 2 minutes of Trevor Noah's dissertation at the Correspondence Center. And if you haven't heard that, I would really urge that you listen to it. What I said was that not that the decision has eroded confidence in the FDA, but the discussion of the decision and the way that's happened has caused, regular people who are not concerned about this every day to wonder, what's going on. Is the FDA doing a good job? And so, and you use the term the advisory committee process. The important point here is, I think it's critical. The advisory committee is a subject of academic work, prominently by some people in the Harvard system and others who actually get contracts and grants from the FDA to do their own independent study. And it turns out that 25% of advisory committee recommendations, the FDA goes a different direction because advisory committees are advisory. The decisions are actually made by full-time civil servants who by law can have no financial conflict of interest. And the commissioner, since I'm a political appointee, the commissioner doesn't weigh in on or override individual product decisions except in very rare cases, like a handful of cases. And so what's interesting about those 25% of cases where the FDA goes a different direction, in the majority of those cases, the FDA makes a more stringent, more restrictive decision than was advised by the advisory committee. And in this case, the FDA made a more open, lenient decision, giving more access in its decision than the advisory committee had recommended, in fact, a lot more. So this is not highly unusual to have a difference of opinion because you're asking advice from the civil service to advisors. You're not asking them to make a decision for you.
So,
and I do plan later in my term to spend considerable time on the advisory committee process. It's a complicated process that I think does need work because the FDA is really, it's really important to FDA to get outside advice, and we need to make sure that we're getting the best advice when we get it.
And do you think there's any impact of this on sort of how the agency will evaluate other future Alzheimer's drugs or frankly any other drugs? Or do you feel that that's something that, as you say, you need to look at going forward?
I don't think this particular decision will change anything inside the FDA. This was a decision about an individual drug based on the details of the data in the view of the review team that was looking at this particular drug. It's well known that there are multiple other antibody-based Alzheimer's therapies that are doing large trials that are going to come in with the outcome data. So we'll have, for the class of drugs, we'll have a plethora of data in the very near future. And so I think the question of when should an accelerated pathway be used will always be a subject of scrutiny from the outside and also a subject of discussion on the inside as a policy matter. And that is where the commissioner has a role in the policies, not in the individual decisions.
All right, thank you. Tazeen, over to you.
Okay, great. So Dr. Califf, earlier one of your predecessors, Scott Gottlieb, had projected that by 2025, FDA would be approving, let's say, 10 to 20 cell and gene therapies annually. Do you still see this as a particularly realistic expectation? And as you mentioned a few minutes ago, the newest iteration of the PDUFA Act is making its way through Congress. That would increase staffing for CBER by over 200 over the next 5 years. And do you think that'll give you the resources that you need to ramp up cell and gene therapy reviews and approvals?
Well, first of all, I think it's a good start. I would just make the point that predicting the number of applications that are going to come through is treacherous, and it's one reason I'm glad on this side of the House, we have an adjustable situation in terms of the budget, so that if additional, if we're overwhelmed with applications, there's a way we can continue to work on the hiring of adequate staff to handle it. That's not true of all the user fee programs, and I think this is a much better way to do it. We're all enthusiastic about these therapies. Like I said, we're referees. We want a victory. We want the teams to play well and play by the rules, and to have a definitive outcome. And so, I think this is a really good start. Peter Marks, who has really been exemplary with the vaccine work in the midst of this terrible pandemic, is very committed to overseeing it, and I'm highly optimistic. And, I know the science has moved along, so, I wonder at times whether the pandemic is sort of, while the science has continued to grow, it's sort of been hard to do all the clinical development. So I wonder if the cap's going to come off here shortly, and we'll see a whole host of applications.
Okay. Dr. Joung?
Great. And so before I ask my next question, I do want to remind the audience that you can submit questions, I believe, through the online access. And so if you have any questions you'd like us to pose to Dr. Califf, please do submit those. So speaking of Peter Marks, he has spoken before about the need for improved regulatory harmonization globally in order to deliver cell and gene therapies to populations that could most benefit from them. What role do you think the FDA can take in actually accomplishing that?
Well, I would just point out that harmonization globally, or proper federation globally, is a very important part of what we need to do, looking at the current state and, critically importantly for the future. We have multiple other regions and countries which are moving ahead in science and investing heavily in biotechnology. And so it just doesn't make sense that we would be acting entirely independently of each other, and particularly given where computation is now. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a common set of data that companies are generating around the world that all the regulators can look at and compare notes. Now, we may make different decisions because, as I said, decisions about how much risk you're willing to take are deeply embedded in culture, not necessarily in science. But that doesn't mean we can't look at the same data, compare and contrast analyses. So I'm hopeful that we'll make real progress here. And some of the terrible things that have happened in the world recently, I think, have reinforced the idea that we have to work together across national boundaries to do the right thing for people.
Great. And actually, I have a question from the audience that's not directly related, but it is cell and gene therapy, so I'll just ask this one. Any modifications for regulatory approval for bespoke therapies, ways to facilitate this? And rare diseases are indeed rare, but they cannot be, it's a comment, rare diseases are indeed rare, but they cannot be ignored.
Well, hopefully, no, hopefully people don't think that we're ignoring rare diseases at the FDA. I think it's been one of the greatest areas of progress due to the devotion of a lot of people inside and outside the FDA to move investment and technology along. And I mean, as you know, there are a number of incentives built into the FDA to assist rare disease groups as they work on the development of therapy. So, I think we'll continue to look at all the options, and as the science gets better, there are a number of thorny issues about how you know if a treatment is actually working when you get down to very small groups of people. And as you also know, one of the areas where FDA does have some funding for research is in natural history studies, which are very important in situations where you have small groups, so that you have some idea of what the trajectory would be had you not intervened, since randomization is not always feasible in these situations.
Okay, great. Tazeen, back to you.
Okay. So COVID has had many impacts on the country, and one of the more unfortunate ones has been the politicization of not just the FDA, but also the CDC. And so how do you see the country getting a handle on the need for rigorous data collection and reporting in the next epidemic and pandemic situation, and balancing that with the need to minimize, if not altogether eliminate, politics from drug approvals, including the Emergency Use Act, Emergency Use Authorization, excuse me.
Yeah, so I've had a chance to address this. I'm in between my Senate and House budget hearing right now. And so I've had a chance to address this, and we have asked for considerable increase in funding, and the CDC has already received it to improve our computational and data capabilities. And I think this is absolutely essential. And I would just point to two key areas that I believe we all need to be thinking about. One is just using technology effectively to have the data that we need at a much lower cost. And by effective use of technology, that means we have to overcome some human issues, and that's point number two. I do think we need to have a broad societal discussion about something that I think all of you probably agree with, is that if we had a disease, we would hope that other people with our disease had contributed their data, either in the form of randomized trials or registries or outcome-based data of some other kind, so that we would best know what to do with our illness. But our system in the U.S. is not working very efficiently and we sort of need to develop a new way of thinking and a societal agreement about data sharing. And that goes for individuals, but also for health systems and others who are right now heavily incentivized to hoard information or data or try to protect it from other people. And that, of course, means that we're going to have the other side of the coin. How do we prevent people from misusing data? So I think that's very important. As far as politicization goes, this is a very serious matter, and I'll just say that it is complicated in situations like a pandemic. I really believe that for the average drug or device approval, while people think they're applying pressure, and there are a lot of stories written about it, I just, my experience at the FDA is you got civil servants, they're working away, they're making their decisions according to the rules, and there's a lot of hypothetical pressure, which I actually don't feel when I'm inside the FDA working on these things. It's hardcore, sleeves rolled up, what's the answer to the question? And a pandemic, it is a bit different. And I think one of the main jobs of the commissioner is to interface between the civil service and all the political apparatus. And I just point to vaccines as a, who would have thought we'd have a vaccine that reduces the risk of death by 90% and antivirals that have another 90% reduction. And yet we still have people who are not getting up-to-date vaccinations and not getting access to the antivirals now that they're available. So that's not a purely science issue. That's deeply embedded in our culture. And so I would argue it's inappropriate to say you shouldn't take into account culture and politics. Somehow we got to protect the science part of it. I agree with that. But the application of the science is deeply political in the environment that we're currently in.
Great.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think, unfortunately, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking Dr. Califf for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.